Lesson 9, we're talking about raising children. This is part 4. I think there might be a part 5, and that might be all the children. We'll move on to something else. I wish kids came with instructions. I said that one time, a long time ago. I wish kids came with instructions. Well, they do. It's just I didn't know it. There was an instruction book, but I wasn't aware of it, and I was even a Christian. But I didn't think about the Bible teaching me how to raise my children. When I made that statement, I learned better. As time went on, I learned better. But the Bible is filled with instructions about raising children, how we are to do it, how important it is, and how we are to do it. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we'll just look at a few verses. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, the same apostle wrote, Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Two things we notice. Number one, the children obeying the parents and the father giving instruction to train the children appear in both of these passages. There's some sort of a link between children being trained and fathers doing training. And secondly, in both passages, the father is told not to provoke his child to anger. In the Roman Empire, it was fairly common for fathers to mistreat their children. It was during the age of thinking, where if you want to raise a good boy, for example, you had to be tough. If you wanted a tough son, you'd had to make him tough. And fathers were unskilled, unpolished for the most part. A lot of them didn't really value their children very much, and they treated them roughly. They were harsh, hard in the way they dealt with their children. And Paul, teaching the Christian fathers especially, don't do that. Don't be guilty of provoking your child to anger. You'll break his spirit in the process. And that's not a good thing. Teach your child like you would teach anybody else. Just because they're your child, a child, that doesn't mean they're surplus. They deserve the respect that you would give to anyone else. And this was something, apparently, because Paul dealt with it so much, that was a problem, at least in the early days of the church. Juvenile delinquency in our country has skyrocketed, and I think we're all aware of it. According to Steinberg, in recent years, the average age for first arrest has dropped significantly. And younger boys and girls are committing crimes. They're not waiting till they get 15 or 16. They're committing these crimes as young as 8 years old. He said between 60 and 80% of adolescents and pre-adolescents engage in some form of juvenile delinquency. That's high. That's a high number, 60 to 80% of juveniles. Two of the two largest predictors of juvenile delinquency are, number one, parenting style, the way people raise their children. The parenting style, with two styles that are most likely to predict delinquency, and those styles are, number one, permissive parenting, characterized by a lack of consequence-based discipline. There's a lot of parents who do not discipline their children. They're not training. The word discipline means training. And there's a lot of ways in which you go about training a child. But there are many parents who are too permissive in this field of work. They're not disciplining their child in such a way that they're developing good people. They're on the buddy system. They want to be friends with their kids rather than an authoritative figure, and they're very permissive. And there are two subtypes that he describes. One is neglectful parenting. It's characterized by a lack of monitoring, not paying attention to what your kids are doing. I remember back years ago when I was a teenager, I guess, we lived in Detroit. Used to about, I think it was 10 o'clock at night, it would come on the TV and say, "Do you know where your children are tonight?" They were trying to get parents to pay attention to their kids. But I noticed here lately on the TV screen, they asked, "Do you know where your parents are tonight?" Because the parents are not home. But neglectful parenting, people are not paying attention to where their kids are, who they're hanging out with, and what they're doing. And therefore, they have a lack of knowledge of the child's activities. They don't know who their friends are. They don't know where they go. They just let them go and assume the best will come out of it. Well, that's not the way it works. Secondly, there's indulgent parenting, affirmative enablement of misbehavior. They take up for the child when the child is wrong. Instead of explaining to the child that they're wrong, instead of taking disciplinary measures, they always come to the child's defense, defending them against anything, anybody, everybody, because my child doesn't do anything wrong. And it's a very unhealthy way to try to raise children. The second style of parenting is authoritarian parenting. And this is characterized by harsh discipline and a refusal to justify discipline on any basis other than because I said so. So one of the biggest problems we see today with regard to juvenile delinquency is parenting. The two extremes, one is too permissive, the other one is too harsh, too hard. A child may be disciplined for doing wrong, but they're not told why they're being disciplined. They're just being disciplined. They're being told what they ought to do because I said so. And you get a lot more mileage if you explain to people why you want them to do what you want them to do. You explain to your child. That's part of teaching. That's part of training. Children don't know the things we know. They don't know that if they do this or that, that this and that might happen. They don't understand that. They haven't been there yet. We have. And rather than just because I said so, we can explain to them the consequences of some of their decisions. It's much better to communicate than it is to just say because I said so. I heard that all my life. And it never flew with me. I didn't think that was a very good reason, so I'd go ahead and do it anyway. That just wasn't a good enough reason. Give them a reason. You're trying to take care of them and protect them. Also, there's peer group association, which most of us expect, particularly with antisocial peer groups, as is more likely when adolescents are left unsupervised. Children that are not supervised by their parents, parents that want to be good friends, parents that want to get along, or parents that don't want to be bothered with their kids, somebody's going to train your child. If you don't do it, little Johnny will train your little girl. He'll tell her everything she needs to know about love and all that stuff. If you don't do it as a mother or father, there's always going to be someone who's willing to do it. So the best thing to do, the right thing to do, is to train our children ourselves. But here's the problem. It's the parenting style and children being overly influenced by their peers. They do what their peers want them to do because they want to be accepted. They want people to think highly of them. They want to fit in somewhere. They want to get along. And they go with the crowd, which oftentimes leads to big trouble. Family factors, according to Graham and Bowling, which may have an influence on offending, include the level of parenting supervision, and he's in agreement. Too many parents aren't taking the adequate time to supervise their children properly, and the children are being taught by someone other than the parent. The way parents discipline a child, it could be a lack or it could be harsh punishment. Harsh punishment is it's very bad. It's not good. It's not right to beat a child with your fist. It's not right to hurt a child as though that child was a horse or something. You discipline a child, you may have to spank them, but there's a lot of ways to discipline a child, and you certainly don't need to hit them and hurt them or their little bones. There's better ways to do it than that, but they must be disciplined. Without discipline, the child will grow up with a lot of problems. Another problem, parental conflict or separation. So many times the husband and wife say, this is between us, it doesn't affect anybody else. I don't know if they really believe that or if they just don't have a clue. A husband and wife gets a divorce, it affects their parents, it affects their children, and it affects people around them. But I could see where it especially affects their children. The home is supposed to be the foundation. That's the place you go when you got to rest. That's the place you go when you're going to be safe. That's the place you can always count on. You go home. But when the home is broken, it breaks this security of the child. And it's very hard on children. They don't have that safety zone any longer. Because if mama and daddy can break up, anything can go awry. And they look for another safety net. A lot of times, at least in the major cities, children will join these gangs because that gives them a family. But this is listed as a contributor to the problem, and I would suggest that it is a very big contributor to this problem. I can't imagine. I know when I grew up as a young child, I always knew home would be there. I always knew it. And I liked it. I mean, my mother and my father, both of them whooped me. They made me do this. They made me do the other. You know, when I got a little older, they started grounding me. They started taking stuff away from me. We didn't have, what do you call it, timeout? We didn't have timeout. You go to your room. We didn't have TVs in our room or stereos or anything else. I remember one time my little brother, he was told to go his room, and he said, be glad to. Why, he had TV and everything in there. He was happy to go in there. But parental conflict, it robs a child of that solid foundation that so many of us have had all of our life. Even now, at my age, I still reflect on the security of the family that I was raised in. But a lot of children have lost that, and it's hard on them. It's got to be hard. Criminal parents and siblings. This causes problems for kids. Your mom and daddy's a thief, your brother's a thief, maybe you'll be a thief too. You know, you might just follow the leader. Parental abuse or neglect will surely lead to problem. If you get beat like a horse, you're probably going to go out and beat like a horse. And then the quality of the parent-child relationship. There needs to be a relationship between the parents and the children. And so many times there is not one, at least not one that's healthy. It's either they're friends or it's almost non-existent because I told you to. But Daddy, you know, he needs to talk to his kids. He needs to let them know he loves them. He needs to let them see that soft side of him. And mothers, you need to communicate with your kids. Talk about things. Get to know each other. It's very important in developing a relationship. We go back to Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Paul said, obey your parents. Secondly, he said, honor your father and your mother. And then he said, this is the first commandment with a promise. What exactly does that mean? There's a lot of things people speculate. I'll tell you what I speculate, and that is this. When Moses gave the Ten Commandments the second time in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, this is where Paul quoted from. You'll notice that the first 4 commandments deal with man's responsibility to God. The last 6 commandments deals with man's responsibility to man. Well, as you look at the 10 commandments, you come to commandment number 5, honor your father and your mother, and there's a promise attached to it. That your days may be long, that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. That's the first commandment God gave to the Israelites that had a promise attached to it. And I believe that's what Paul's alluding to. Nothing more sophisticated than just that. Well, let's go by that and think a little bit more. Obey your parents. The apostle gives us 2 reasons. Number 1, for this is right. It's the right thing to do. You kids, listen to me now. Obey your parents. Well, I'm only 8 years old. I understand that, but it's time to listen. Give me 10 minutes. Obey your parents, for this is the right thing to do. In Colossians 3:20, Paul said, this is well-pleasing to the Lord. This makes God happy. When you obey your parents, you 8-year-old, it makes God happy. He's happy with you because you're doing what he tells you to do. So the 2 reasons Paul gives us in these 2 epistles is it's the right thing to do and it's well-pleasing to the Lord. Now, parents, think about this. Think hard. Children, obey your parents because this makes God happy. And what happens if children don't obey you? What does that make God feel toward your 8-year-old child? It's your responsibility to teach your child to obey you. And you got to do what it takes to get them to do that. If God is happy when your 8-year-old obeys you, he's going to be very sad when that same child does not. You don't want God angry with your child. Do what you need to do to make your child obey you. Because this is what God wants. You can be a friend when they get older. Right now, you've got to be an authority figure. You have got to teach them to respect you, especially you. He also went on to give 2 promises, and the one is that it may be well with you, that you may enjoy a good life, and the second one is right below it, that you may live long on the earth. If the child obeys you, if they honor their mother and father, they're going to enjoy a better life while they're in this world, and they're probably going to live beyond the average age of most people. Now, this isn't a pat rule. It's not a guarantee. But generally speaking, for the great majority, this is what's going to happen. They're going to have a better life while they live now, and they're going to live longer. That's a promise that came from God. And if God made the promise, we can count on the promise. So, child, it's in your best interest. If you want a good life and a long life, you listen to your parents. And parents, you love your children. Be sure to make them mind you, because once again, it's in their best interest that they do that. When we think about Colossians 3:20, it's imperative that we consider the context, because the context is going to show us something we might not otherwise see. Let me show you. In verse 18, Paul said, wives, submit to your husbands. Verse 19, husbands, love your wives. Verse 21, fathers, do not provoke your children. And then in verse 22, bondservants, obey your masters. Okay? He's talking about different things. He's not just talking about in our relationship with the Lord. But as far as the children, obey your parents in all things. So in this particular text, wives, husbands, children, fathers, and slaves are all given instructions. And then the apostle said, whatever you do, as a wife, a husband, a child, a father, or a slave, whatever you do, anything you do, in all things that you do, do it heartily. Do it from the heart, as though you were doing it to Jesus Christ himself and not to men. Obey your parents, because that's what your Lord wants you to do. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Why? Because that's what your Lord wants you to do. In all things do good, knowing that from the Lord you receive your inheritance, because he's the one that we serve. As a father, as a child, as a husband, I have to do it heartily, all these responsibilities to the best of my ability in all facets of my life. And this is the way parents are to raise children, in all facets of their life. It's not just to put clothes on their back. It's not to put a roof over their head. It's not just to put food on the table, but it goes much, much farther than that. In all facets of life. Look at this verse. He who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done. And there is no partiality. Either we do it or we don't do it. And if we don't do it, the Lord's going to hold us accountable for it. In Proverbs 22 and verse 6, here's another verse. I think it's important that we understand the context, because the context gives us some understanding as to what this verse is teaching. In verses 1 through 5, Paul is speaking about the same things, basically, as he's speaking about in verses 7 through 10. But for time's sake, let's just look at the latter. The rich rules over the poor. The borrower is servant to the lender. He who sows iniquity will reap sorrow. The rod of his anger will fail. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Cast out the scoffer, and contention will leave. Yes, strife and reproach will cease. What is my point? In their context, the apostle is talking about how we are to live in various phases of our life, in matters religiously, but also in matters that deal with life in general. Most of the time when we read Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6, we think about training up a child religiously. And that's an important part. But that's not all it means. Train up a child in every facet of his life. Literally, train up a child in the way he leans. Take him as he is and help him develop and become who he is. That's what Solomon is actually saying. The way of a child should go in their relationship with the Lord and in general, their way of life. Yes, we train them up to know God. We also train them up to be a worker when they become an adult, to find some sort of career path that they want to follow or go after. It's the responsibility of us as parents to get our children grounded and off to a good start in their adulthood, not just in religion alone. The childhood of Christ is summed up in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, and this, I think, gives us some insight. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. There isn't much said about the childhood of our Lord in the Bible, but this is said. It tells us how Jesus developed as a child. And I suggest to you this is the way all children develop. And how is it? They develop intellectually, physically, socially, and spiritually. Train up a child in the way he should go intellectually, and the way he should go physically, socially, or spiritually. This, I believe, is what Solomon is teaching us to do in our relationship with God, in our relationship with man, and able to live life out in general. That's the responsibility of the parent. Teach your child self-control. If your child is out of control, get them under control. Nowadays, people are sticking too many kids on drugs to calm them down or boost them up or whatever's going on. You know, people used to have a way to bring us under control, and it wasn't that hard. I don't know why everything's changed all of a sudden. But you've got to bring your child or teach your child self-control. Your child needs an education. I'm a firm believer in education. All people aren't cut out for college, but I'd like to see all people go to college. I think it's very important, the things we learn through a college education. Not necessarily just for the information we receive. A lot of it is useless. But there's a whole lot of it that's good, and there's a lot of things you learn in school that you really want to know before you get out into the world of work. But you're responsible to make sure your child is educated properly. Kids should know how to read. They should know how to do math. They've got to do this to survive as an adult. We're living in a computer age. It ain't like it used to be. If a child hasn't got some sort of an education, they're going to have to do menial labor for the next 50 years of their life. We can educate, get our children educated. We find out what they want to do, which may take a lifetime to do, but we try to help our children get ready to go off on their own and stand on their own 2 feet. That's the way we were trained, and that's the way we should train ours. You got to teach your child to have a good work ethic. Man, there's so many kids right now, they come in wanting a job, and they don't want that job. Before I left my job, they brought a guy out to me they hired, and he was going to work for me. I didn't have time to fool with him. So I told him to stand on the paint booth, and I said, whatever that guy does, you do the same thing. And I went off and did whatever I had to do. Well, I came back, and that guy, he was still just standing there. He wasn't doing, he was watching. And I asked him, I said, you going to help him or not? He said, I don't want to do this job. And I was being a little bit facetious. I said, well, what would you like to do? He said, I want that guy's job over there. And he was serious as a heart attack. And I said, no, this is going to be your job right here. He said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, if you're going to stay here, you got to do it. And he said, well, I guess I won't stay here. And he left. I've had them come in, they leave, they go out at dinner. I figure they're going over to the Big Mac or something, and they never come back. And those that do stay, a lot of them, a whole lot of them, they don't earn their dinner for what they do. There's a generation of kids that don't know how to work. They weren't raised to work. They weren't taught to work. Parents, you've got to teach your kids how to work. They've got to have a work ethic if they're going to survive as an adult, unless you want to keep them up for the rest of their life or have them start breaking into people's houses. Teach your child to work. Used to, when I ran out of things for my kids to do, I'd have them go out in the yard and pick up rocks so the lawnmower wouldn't hit them. Have them do something besides sit in front of that TV or in front of a computer screen. We take kids to camp and they don't have a TV. They can't stand it. They go back home by Monday. And we went to camp on Sunday. And they've already having, they're crashing because of their addiction to TV. They don't know how to be outside. They don't know how to play unless they got something in their hands. Children have got to learn how to work, because people are not going to employ them if they don't know how to work. You got to teach them to have brotherly love. Teach them to love their fellow Christians. You do that by teaching them to love you, by teaching them to love their siblings. You have a home environment where there's an atmosphere of love, and the child learns to love others. because you're teaching them about the value of the church and what the church is. And they learn to love others in the church as well as out of the church. Teach your child to have good manners. That's something that's absent a lot now. Thank you. You're welcome. It's so easy. And it's almost unseen anymore. But when a kid uses good manners, I don't know about you, it always gets my attention. Because it's something you don't hear all that much. You remember what it was like when we were kids? If I called a grown person by their first name, my daddy'd whoop me. I went to the bowling alley, and the woman that worked there, she wanted everybody to call her Wilma. I was 10 years old or something. I called her Wilma. One day we had a father and son bowling tournament. Daddy was there, and I called her Wilma, and he took me out of that building and tore me up. You don't call her Wilma. You call her Aunt Wilma, you call her Miss Wilma, or you call her by Miss whatever her last name was. But you never call an adult by their first name. Manners. Children need to be taught manners. Because they are children. They need to learn to respect their elders, to look out for their elders, to pay attention to the elderly people. Sometimes, children can hurt an older person, not meaning to. But the elderly people have a hard time getting around. There's got to be respect for the elderly. And we should respect our elderly. Were it not for them, we wouldn't be here anyway. And the more feeble I get, the more caution I need them to exercise. I'm afraid I'm going to fall down and break like Humpty Dumpty. We need to teach our children to respect and submit to authority. If your child doesn't submit to your authority, they're not going to submit to their teacher. They're not going to submit to their government. They're not going to submit to their God. Parents are to learn their children to submit to their authority because they are the parents. The children are the children. The children aren't supposed to run the house. The parents are supposed to. But so many times it's the child making the decisions. But that's the parent's job. And the parent has to teach the child to do it. You know what the kids, I don't want to do it. There was a lot of things I didn't want to do, but I wound up doing it. I didn't want to eat my vegetables, and Mama said, well, you don't get no dessert. I learned to eat vegetables because I like dessert so good. There's ways to do it, but you've got to teach your child to submit to your authority. You've got to teach your child how to be a good spouse. They're going to get married one day. Teach them how to be a good husband or wife. Teach them how to be a good parent when they have children. One of the things that's going to happen, and this really breaks my heart, there are so many children that start out in their adult life, and they're not ready. They're not ready. I talk to a lot of them, and they are not ready. They can't manage a checkbook. They have no concept of some type of a financial plan system. They don't understand making payments on an apartment or a house or paying rent. They don't understand hardly anything. Not all children, but there's a lot of children. They don't know how to function as an adult because no one taught them. When you're born knowing nothing. And everything you learn, you've got to learn from another source. And that's why God made parents. Teach your kids. Help them to be prepared to make the right decisions. Of course, you help them to make the right decision when it comes to God. That is always the number one responsibility of the parent. But we've also got to teach them how to survive because we're going to die. And if we die and that kid's 18 years old, are they going to melt or are they going to make it? It's very important that we train our children. I know we love our children. I'm not talking about that. But there are a multitude of philosophies as to how you go about raising a child. God teaches us how we are to raise children. And all we've got to do is look at his rule book and then follow his pattern. If you're not a Christian, you were given your life. God created you. that you would make a decision to walk through life with him, your Creator. You ought to believe that Jesus died for your sins. Stop sinning and be immersed in water, because that's when God said he forgives sin. Colossians 2 and verse 12. As Christians, we have responsibilities. Every way we look, we have responsibilities. And we're to do what God has authorized us to do in every facet of our life. Of course, we've been talking about the family, and the family is very important. Don't underestimate the importance of your family. In the eyes of God, it is very important. We fail. We don't want to, we fail. I failed on many occasions as a parent. I failed many times as a husband. And I'd have to repent, get back on my feet, and start again. Maybe you're there today. I don't know. But if you need God's forgiveness, please come while we stand and while we sing. Rock of Ages.